the soul of a new machine for Wallach's golden moment, a young computer engineer, known to be one of the most skillful in Westborough's basement, said he had a fantasy about a better job than his. In it, he goes to work as a janitor for a computer company whose designs leave much to be desired. There, at night, disguised by mop and broom, he sneaks into the offices of the company's engineers and corrects the designs on their blackboards and desks. Dreams of pure freedom were not uncommon in the basement. For those who had such fantasies, the best job imaginable would allow them to try to build the unattainable, the perfect computer. What, by contrast, would be one of the worst jobs? One that obliged an engineer to build a kludge. Tom West had to deal with such feelings. This was one of the first and most difficult of his problems. West needed an architect. In computers, an architecture describes what a machine will look like to the people who are going to write software for it. It tells not how the machine will be built, but what it will do in detail. Drawing up such a blueprint would be the crucial first technical act in the making of this 32-bit, fully Eclipse-compatible computer that could have no mode bit. West wasn't absolutely certain that such a machine could be made. If it could, what would be the best approach? He had no idea, but he thought he knew who would. Right at the start, West decided that a Data General employee named Steve Wallach should be Eagle's architect. "He's the only guy for that job," said West. "The guy's a walking dictionary and encyclopedia of computers. He's the best guy in the world for that job." Accordingly, West called Wallach to his office in the spring of 1978 and asked him to draw up the architecture for a 32-bit Eclipse. Steve Wallach glared at West. Wallach got to his feet and, coining a phrase, said, "Fuck that, I'm not putting a bag on the side of the Eclipse." Then he stomped out of West's office. For a time after that, Chuck Holland, an engineer who had been with the team a couple of years, worked on the architecture. He did a great deal of work and an entirely creditable job as far as he was allowed to go. To West, however, no one else but Wallach would do. He'd get Wallach to sign up somehow. Wallach, he believed, really did want to work on a 32-bit Eclipse. He just didn't know it yet. West knew Wallach. He figured that as much as Wallach wanted to work with a clean sheet of paper and no constraints, he wanted two other things more. These were tangible success and revenge. Wallach was raised in Brooklyn. His father was a compositor, a practitioner of the craft of hot metal typesetting, which will soon be all but demolished by the craft that Wallach chose to pursue. There is irony in that, but Wallach didn't think it lamentable. He remembered his father coming home from work with his clothes and hands covered with indelible printer's ink, and his father saying that he did not want his son growing up to come home dirty too. The younger Wallach's talents showed themselves early. He was a frequent and successful entrant in children's science fairs. He went to Stuyvesant High, one of New York City's best public schools. His grade point average, he remembered it exactly, was 93.67, and he graduated 48th in his class. He won scholarships, first to Brooklyn Polytechnic, where he discovered computers and got his bachelor's degree, then to the University of Pennsylvania, where he took a master's in electrical engineering. Then he went to work at Honeywell in Massachusetts. In one of his first jobs, Wallach worked as junior engineer on a piece of a fancy new computer. But just as that machine was nearly complete, Honeywell merged with General Electric, and when the dust settled, the new computer had been scrapped. It never came to light. If Job had been a computer engineer, his travail would have begun in that way. "Engineers want to produce something," said Wallach. "I didn't go to school for 6 years just to get a paycheck. I thought that if this is what engineering's all about, the hell with it." He went to night school to get a master's in business administration. "I was always looking for the buck. I'd get the MBA, go back to New York, and make some money," he figured. But he didn't really want to do that. He wanted to build computers. He took a job at Raytheon, and in time he was assigned to work on another fancy new machine, something called the Advanced Avionics Digital Computer. The Navy was paying for its development. According to Wallach, he and another young engineer did most of the actual work on it. One day, a team of Navy consultants trooped through their lab. The consultants proclaimed the machine too complex. They said that the engineers would never get it to work. They were wrong. Wallach and his colleague brought the computer to life. "Near the end, we probably worked 100 hours a week," he remembered. "We fought over every little detail, no holds barred, and then we'd go out and play bridge." But then the Navy decided not to build any more of the machines. To be quite honest, from day one we suspected that the Navy probably wouldn't buy it. It was more that the high-class consultants came in and said we wouldn't get it to work. We said, fuck that, don't tell us what we can do. All in all, Wallach felt pleased about that piece of work. It was a technical success, he said, and it bolstered his reputation. Once again, however, his machine did not, as West would say, get out the door. Wallach went to date a general a few years later. The bait that lured him was the promise that he'd get to work right from the start, on the ground floor, on the new, supra-state-of-the-art machine that became FHP. Great excitement attended the beginnings of this project. The lucky engineers assigned to it would work on it outside of the plant, in an apartment. For the sake of security, this was such an important project. There was a meeting. An executive tossed a set of keys onto the table. They were the keys to the apartment, and the room number matched the alias of secret agent James Bond. 7. Wallach liked that touch, but he was most impressed by the fact that the company would place no important constraints upon the designers of the new computer. They could pursue pure technical excellence. They were being given a clean sheet of paper. To himself, Wallach said, "Wow!" He worked on the grand machine for 2 years. He read and he studied, putting the finishing touches on what was already an encyclopedic knowledge of the best that had been thought and done in computers. Nothing but the best would be good enough for FHP. He lived for that machine. But then the unfinished plans and many of the designers went to North Carolina. Wallach felt he couldn't go. Thus he lost another machine, the best of them all so far. Wallach was one of several engineers who, working day and night, designed the comely Ego after FHP went south. Then Ego was canceled for the first time. Wallach got a few things from his office and stomped out of Westboro. He went home for 2 weeks. Around the time that he returned, DEC announced the VAX. Studying the VAX's architecture, Wallach felt sad. Some of VAX's features were remarkably like Ego's, but Ego was better, Wallach believed. He felt very angry. We had DEC where we wanted them with Ego. It was Wallach who suggested to West the idea for Victor. Wallach worked on that machine for a time. Victor died gradually. Ego was revived, and for a little while Wallach really thought that they'd get to build it after all. But De Castro turned it down again. Wallach had now spent more than a decade working on computing equipment. He'd had a hand in the design of 5 computers, all good designs in his opinion. He had worked long hours on all of them. He had put himself into those creatures of metal and silicon. And he had seen only one of them come to functional life, and in that case, the customer had decided not to buy the machine. When E.G. Ominous 2 got shot down, Wallach went home again in a rage. Once more, he stayed away for 2 weeks, but when he came back, he was still angry. He got angrier when West suggested that he create the architecture for a 32-bit Eclipse, because the constraints upon Eagle seemed imprisoning. Eagle would be backward and messy. What a come-down working on it would be. Clearly, however, Wallach was a man who was ready to get a machine out the door. The soles of Wallach's cowboy boots faced his office door. He was stretched out in his chair, his feet up on his desk. He was slender, not skinny, with wavy brown hair that was slicked back but still a little unruly. His complexion was pale, for making computers is an indoor occupation, and not much vitamin D got into the basement. He was in his mid-30s. Wallach had his own, real if windowless office down the hall from West's. It was just like West's in its skeleton, but differently adorned. Here, enthusiasm lay under less than strict control. Papers lay all over the flat surfaces. Ferns in pots hung from the ceiling. Stuck with pins to the walls were cartoons, T-shirts, posters, postcards, and over by the doorway a brown paper bag. A joke, the figurative bag on the side of Eclipse given material shape. One of Wallach's posters was a blown-up reproduction of Saul Steinberg's droll cartoon depicting the United States. New York City occupies the entire foreground of the picture. California is awarded a much smaller, but significant, space in the background, and the states in between take up about as much room as the lettuce in a club sandwich. Wallach said he liked this poster for its accuracy. It also made him think of North Carolina, one of those states that got short shrift in the cartoon. Wallach had been offered the chance to go south with FHP. Indeed, he had been encouraged to go. Why had he refused? "I thought North Carolina sucked," he explained. "I told them, that's not a place where I want to bring up my wife and family." I was given a tour of Chapel Hill, and somebody told me that more people per capita read the New York Times in Chapel Hill than in all the rest of the state. I said, "It sounds like the Warsaw Ghetto you just described." Hey, when I wake up in the morning, I want to hear the stock market report on the radio, not the price of tobacco and hogs. And what they considered good food, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Wallach sniffs, wrinkles his nose, and then delivers such lines with his chin forward, as if daring someone to hit it. I said, "That's not a place where I want to bring up my wife and children." He made me laugh. He watched, smiling. Carl Alsing gleefully related that once, when an engineer in the basement was describing how rough it had been to grow up in India, Wallach burst into claiming that India was easy. That man should have tried growing up in Brooklyn, where you had to fight your way from one ethnic neighborhood to another just to get to school. Wallach remembered that when he was very young, another boy on his street punched him and he didn't hit back. His father punished him for this failure to retaliate. Asked to describe his old neighborhood, Wallach said, "Let's put it this way. You learn very quickly that if someone hits you, you hit them back twice as hard, so they won't hit you again." When I met Wallach, he was living in a residential neighborhood in Framingham, Massachusetts, in a new and prosperous-looking housing development. His house was gray and clapboarded in the colonial style. It was pretty. Inside, it was immaculate. He sat in his living room on a white easy chair telling what amounted to old war stories. One concerned an executive whom Wallach had believed to be an enemy of the Eclipse group. Wallach had decided to play with the turkey's mind. For a week, every time he ran into this man, Wallach would smile at him. The following week, however, whenever Wallach encountered the man, he would make himself look sad. Finally, the executive could stand it no longer and asked for an explanation, which was what Wallach had been waiting for. "Steve, how come you're so happy to see me sometimes, and then sometimes you look like you wish I wasn't there?" "I don't know," said Wallach. "I'm very moody." "Then," recalled Wallach, "I went into my office, closed the door, and got hysterical." Wallach's wife overheard this tale. "Steve, that's terrible," she said. "I live with this," she added, turning to me, but I noticed that she was smiling. While Wallach was talking in this vein, his 4-year-old daughter was circling the room on roller skates, across the wall-to-wall carpeting. Considering the whiteness of his chair and his proclivity to battle, I expected Wallach to yell at her at any moment, but I soon got the feeling that he did not often raise his voice in anger while at home. When the little girl skated up behind him and planted a wet, loud kiss on his cheek, Wallach beamed. "That's why you have daughters." You had to understand the context in which Wallach practiced his martial arts. His swords were usually technical issues, and he left them at work. Moreover, in the last few years, he had been sorely provoked. He felt, he said, like an animal thrown in a cage. In this situation, Wallach allowed, he was a rough customer. On one of his many visits to North Carolina during the so-called Ego Wars, he was presented with a poster depicting the hideous face of the arch-villain of Star Wars, Darth Vader himself. "We got this just for you," Wallach was told. He liked to tell that story. When FH Peace Removal South had been announced, Wallach had felt robbed and insulted. Then he had felt astonished and dismayed when he had read the article in the Globe that seemed to have De Castro denigrating the engineers at Westboro. Wallach called up the reporter. Pretending to be an important Data General executive, he badgered the fellow into reading his notes over the phone. On the basis of this conversation, Wallach decided that De Castro had been quoted out of context. But the story left a bad taste. Wallach heard the people who were going south with FHP say that North Carolina was where the action was and would be from now on. He became convinced that neither the defectors to North Carolina nor De Castro himself believed that the stay-behinds at Westboro would produce significant machines in the future. He took the whole affair as a personal insult. A slap in the face. He had to retaliate. Working on ego was his first attempt to do so. "Like I said, I'm a fighter, and the challenge was to prove the man in the corner office in North Carolina wrong." In the Ego Wars, Wallach served as West's Hessian. West didn't feel angry toward North Carolina, nor could he afford to appear hostile. But arguments are arguments. Certain nasty things had to be said. Wallach was good at saying them and happy to do it. He served, he said afterward, as West's gun in the shootouts. But in the end, Wallach got beaten. Ego was canceled, not because it wasn't a good design, but because it was too good, too much of a threat to steal the show from North Carolina. West never fully believed this, but Wallach always did. When West started talking, after all of that, about building a 32-bit Eclipse, Wallach sneered, partly because it seemed to him that this was just the sort of project that North Carolina would have wished on him. An insignificant, kludgy machine that probably wouldn't get out the door. He'd rather stand in honorable defiance than work on such a thing. He was quitting the fight, he said, and soon he would leave Data General. Meanwhile, thinking in the fastness of his office, West decided that he had made a mistake. He had not presented Eagle in the proper light to Wallach. Over the next few weeks, he had many long conversations with the reluctant architect. He listened to Wallach's complaints. He agreed that Wallach had been treated badly. "But haven't you realized yet that the way to prove someone wrong is to build the right thing?" West asked, time and time again. Finally, somewhat exasperated, but also suspecting that Wallach was ready to yield, West forced the issue. "Either you do this or your job description is inoperative," he said to Wallach one day. The phrasing appealed greatly to Wallach, and he could see that West was probably right. Conceiving architectures was his job, and Eagle was the only project around that needed an architect. But Wallach had seen too many projects canceled in spite of their merits to believe that Eagle would go out the door just because it promised to be a good commercial machine. He wasn't going that route again. Wallach wanted to talk to DeCastro. This was not a completely extraordinary request. DeCastro's office, Wallach knew, would usually open for an engineer who had something to say. As Wallach remembered it later for those who questioned him about it, this was the gist of his conversation with the president. "Can I be straight with you?" asks Wallach. DeCastro nods. "Okay," says Wallach. "What the fuck do you want?" "I want a 32-bit Eclipse," says DeCastro. "Are you sure if we do this you won't cancel it on us? You'll leave us alone?" "That's what I want, a 32-bit Eclipse and no mode bit." Wallach returned to West's office, and now, at long last and sniffing, he said, "Okay, Tom, one more time." "The document's yours," West replied. "You gotta do it fast." Wallach went to his office and closed the door. Some months later, a careful examination of Wallach's quarters revealed many scuff marks etched in shoe polish low down along his walls, and there was a dent higher up on one wall. These were bruises, left over from Wallach's labor on the machine. When he sat down, alone in his office, Wallach reasoned that since the whole purpose of this ridiculous undertaking was 32-bithood, the enlargement of the Eclipse's logical address space from 65,000 to 4.3 billion storage compartments, he might as well begin by figuring out how the compartments would be organized, managed, and the information in them protected. He further decided, he called this the methodical engineering approach, to worry about memory management first. Clearing a space on his desk, he placed a yellow legal pad in front of him and drew a picture of the standard 32-bit address, a box containing 32 bits which looked like this. He began to divide up the space inside this box. If you imagine the computer's storage, its memory, to be a large collection of telephones, then what Wallach was doing might be described as designing a logical system by which phones and groups of phones could be easily identified. A system of area codes, for instance. Next to Wallach's desk stood several tall metal bookcases. Their shelves from floor to ceiling were stuffed, with loose-leaf binders and fat volumes in plain covers that bore titles such as Parallelism in Hardware and Software, Real and Apparent Concurrency. The binders contained specifications for nearly every sort of computer ever made, and for some that had never been constructed. Wallach called his bookcase Data General's de facto library. He claimed that he had most of this library in his head. From time to time, he wheeled around in his chair and took a binder down from the bookcase. By the end of the day, Wallach had roughed out the divisions of the standard 32-bit address, and he said to himself, "Okay, great. So far I've done nothing." He gave the wall near his door a kick as he left. Wallach wasn't ready to admit that he was having fun, but he was back in his office early the next morning. He had a workable general plan for managing memory. Now for the question of how to protect the stored information. This had become one of the important questions in the computer industry. It had arisen largely because of a practice called time-sharing. In the basement of Westboro, for example, every engineer had a computer terminal, typewriter-like keyboard plus video screen, and most of these terminals were hooked up to a single large Eclipse, located some distance away, behind one of the locked doors that warned against unauthorized entry. So long as the central computer didn't become overloaded, each of the engineers, at his separate desk, could enjoy the illusion that he alone had access to the computer, though in fact they were all sharing it. It was a common sort of system. Much more exotic ones existed. Time-sharing already took place not only within buildings, but between them and across continents and oceans. Increasingly, computers communicated with other computers across vast distances. Many organizations stored very valuable information in their computers. In a sense, banks store their money in computer systems, and oil companies store their crown jewels, their seismic information, in computerized data banks. Publicized cases of thievery and espionage by computer were legion at this time. Experts generally agreed that most electronic criminals were never caught, and that many who were never got prosecuted, because an organization that had been successfully attacked either didn't want the embarrassing publicity or feared that the news would encourage other raids. Many people had taken a crack at solving such problems, notably a group of engineers and computer scientists at MIT who worked with money from the Department of Defense on a project called MULTICS. In the late 60s, they produced a complex plan for making time-sharing systems secure. It was a clever plan, but many experts believed that no system of protection yet devised could withstand the efforts of smart pranksters or thieves bent on foiling it. One organization had purchased a very fine system for protecting its computerized data banks, but a determined group had cracked it. Pretending to be the manufacturer of the security system, they had sent to the organization a bogus set of revisions to the system's software. Without affecting the system's performance, these revisions left open a trapdoor, through which the thieves were able to withdraw important information from the organization's data bank. The anecdote was one of Wallach's favorites. "I'm not gonna try and solve the world's problems here," he conceded. He'd forget about trying to stymie the malicious user and concentrate instead on preventing accidental damage. Inadvertently, users of a time-sharing system could alter the contents of the host computer's memory, and in this way destroy valuable data and foul up system software. Plans such as MULTICS were workable solutions to this problem. Wallach was proceeding almost on instinct now. In his 2 years of work on FHP, he believed, he had read every published description of every system for protection that had ever been devised. In the ordinary case, an architect might linger over the various possibilities for months. Wallach didn't have time for that, and he really didn't need it. Very quickly, he chose what he believed to be the simplest and best general solution, the general idea that came out of MULTICS, which DEC, as it happened, had used in the VAX. This was a system of rings. Picture an army encampment in which all the tents are arranged in several concentric rings. The general's tent lies at the center, and he can move freely from one ring of tents to another. In the next ring out from the center live the colonels, say, and they can move from their ring into any outer ring as they please, but they can't intrude on the general's ring without his dispensation. The same rules apply all the way to the outermost ring, where the privates reside. They have no special privileges. They can't move into any ring inside their own without permission. Analogously, each ring defines some part of the computer's memory. How does the computer mediate a user's access to these various areas? In the general case, it compares two numbers, the number of the ring to which the user has free access and the number of the ring that the user wants to get into. If the user's ring number is smaller than or equal to the number of the ring that the user wants to enter, the user is allowed to go in. But how should ring numbers be assigned to the compartments of memory? That was the question before Wallach. With the VAX, DECS engineers had solved the problems of memory management and the protection of memory separately. Each compartment in memory had an address, and each compartment also had a separate ring number, which was produced and checked by a special set of hardware. Wallach had studied the specs on VAX. He didn't like that approach. From the back of his mind came the recollection of a conversation he'd had at a conference of engineers from different companies some years before. At such convocations, the usual way of getting acquainted is to ask other engineers what projects they've worked on. Wallach remembered an engineer telling him about a ring system he'd thought up and never built, in which ring numbers and addresses were mingled. Wallach had gotten the fellow to send him a spec. It had looked a little clumsy to him, but there was the germ of something there. Wallach drew another diagram of the standard 32-bit address. The first 3 bits of the address would contain the segment number of a memory compartment. In the telephone analogy, a given compartment's area code. The other bits would define the rest of the address. But Wallach wasn't interested in them just now. He was pondering the first 3 bits. Suddenly, without thinking about it, he was drawing another box below the first box. The diagram now looked like this. The segment number, the area code, would be the same as the ring number, which defined the level of security to which the compartment would be assigned. 3 bits can be combined in 8 different ways. So there would be 8 rings, 8 levels of security, and 8 segments, 8 area codes in the memory system. The area codes would themselves indicate which ring was forbidden to whom. Although they are generally shy about claiming to have had one, Engineers often speak of the golden moment in order to describe the feeling. It comes rarely enough, when the scales fall from a designer's eyes and a problem's right solution is suddenly there. The chief virtue of Wallach's scheme was its simplicity. It would be relatively cheap and easy to implement in hardware and software, and it should work efficiently and reliably. When Alsing saw Wallach's brief description of the plan, he said to Wallach, "That's nice." Later, out of Wallach's earshot, he said more, "Rings have been around, they're old hat." What makes Wallach a good data general engineer is that he came up with a really elegant subset of those ideas. Simple, sweet, cheap, efficient, clean. And I can't believe I just said that about Wallach. As for Wallach, after he had drawn the diagram, he stared at it, wondering for a moment, "Where did that come from?" He kept eyeing it. "That looks pretty cool." For the next couple of days, Wallach played with the idea until he was sure it would work. Then he pulled his computer terminal in front of him and wrote up a memo, which told how others had handled memory management and protection in the past, and which described his own general scheme. Near the end of the memo, his sarcasm rose. He described the plan as a kludge, but a better one than DEC had put into VAX. He kicked his walls a few times. The idea of placing that neat, clean structure on top of the outdated structure of the Eclipse repelled him. It was as if he had invented a particularly nice kind of arch for the doorway of a supermarket. Wallach was a scholar of computer architectures. He knew by heart the works of the Michelangelos, the Frank Lloyd Wrights, and the Gaudis of the computer profession. He imagined himself standing in front of a room full of experts when Eagle was all done. They would question him about the architecture, inserting sharp little knives in his flank, and then twisting them. "Why didn't you do it this way, Steve, when it's obviously better?" And, as he imagined it, his only possible defense would be to plead weakly and traitorously that the company had prevented him from really showing his stuff. The cause of this fretting lay mainly with the instruction set. These are the basic operations that the computer's builders equip it to perform. Typically, instructions bear such names as ADD, which means the computer should perform addition, and skip on equal, which tells the machine to compare two values, and if they are equal to skip the next step in a program. Today, there are a couple hundred instructions or so in most mini-computers' sets. A large part of the art of designing a computer's architecture lies in selecting just the right set of instructions, and in making each instruction as versatile as possible. This art had advanced a great deal since the invention of the Eclipse. But in order to be fully compatible with Eclipses, Eagle would have to contain the same old instruction set in its entirety. DEC had not tried to do that. VAX was not fully compatible with DEC's old 16-bit machines. DEC had given up full compatibility for the sake of giving VAX what Wallach called a super, instruction set. He was somewhat biased. Ego's instruction set had resembled VAX's. Both were examples of the state of the art. The Eclipse's instruction set was an example of what that state used to be. For many months, Wallach would continue to mourn Ego outwardly, and to tell anyone who was interested that if some expert asked him someday why he hadn't invented a better instruction set, he would spill the beans. He'd tell them he had been forbidden to use a mode bit. "I'll say it was because I was told that these were management's objectives, and I was told that I couldn't work on the machine if I wouldn't fit in with management's objectives." But in his own mind, he was changing his tune. He was getting to like the looks of this architecture. He was starting to think of it not as a wart on a wart, but as a clean design with a wart on it. The wart was the Eclipse instruction set, virtually every part of which Eagle would have to contain for the sake of compatibility. But there were some other empty corners of this canvas. Aside from memory management and protection, chiefly, the new 32-bit Eagle instructions. Wallach came up with some that he liked a great deal. In fact, he even found a way to slip in a well-disguised equivalent of a mode bit, which would have allowed him to define a wholly new set of Eagle instructions, ones not at all derivative of Eclipse. But he didn't disguise the mode bit well enough. West found him out. "We're not gonna do that," he said to Wallach. Wallach went back to his office and punched the wall near his door. But West did let his adjutant put into Eagle some new instructions that weren't Eclipse-like. Not all the ideas for new instructions came from Wallach, but sometimes it worked this way. They developed a routine. Wallach would bring West an idea for a new instruction. West would say that it looked like a win, but that it wasn't Eclipse-like. Wallach knew what that meant. If the wrong people saw this new instruction in the spec, it might cause a stir. People upstairs and in North Carolina might get the idea that Eagle was, after all, intended as a challenger to FHP. which it certainly was. So Wallach would take the idea for the new instruction to friends working in system software, and the system programmers would approve the idea. They and Wallach would sit down and fully define the new, non-Eclipse-like instruction, and then Wallach would ask them to write a memo to the Eclipse group, requesting that this instruction be put into Eagle. They wrote the memo, said Wallach, so that the idea would be perceived as coming from them just in case we ever got called on it. Wallach went on, a lot of things we did were unique to that environment. It's clear they weren't always the way things should be done. But you enjoyed doing things that way, I suggested. We all enjoyed it, he said. Anytime you do anything on the sly, it's always more interesting than if you do it up front. After his discovery of the basic scheme for memory management and protection, Wallach had to work out the details, in many long and sometimes loud arguments with Ken Hulberger, sub-lieutenant of the Hardy Boys, who were going to have to implement the architecture. For technical argument, Wallach found Hulberger to be a worthy adversary, and on the whole he enjoyed those debates. Next, all of the instructions had to be defined, as did the precise mechanism by which Eagle would move smoothly. And without the intervention of the user, from programs written for 16-bit Eclipses to ones made for a 32-bit machine. This was a tricky, time-consuming piece of work. Wallach also had to collect all these details and schemes in a document. He took great pains with this volume. He called it My Book, and refining it, rewrote it 7 times over the following months. This book was some 200 pages long, and at the beginnings of each chapter he placed a famous or semi-famous quotation. Wallach said he never read technical tracts outside of work, and that he shared West's suspicions about people who did. At home, he said he mainly read Playboy. I read the short stories, I really do. Yeah, I look at the pictures, but I like the stories. He laughed. He had not read widely in the classics, so the epigraphs for his book didn't come to him without effort. He took the quotes from Victor Hugo, Nietzsche, Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, Santayana, and FDR. Some were playful and some downright witty if you understood the context. At the top of the chapter about the instruction set, for instance, he placed this quote from Macbeth, "We still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions Wallach's cap," which, being taught, returned to plague the inventor. For the chapter about his elegant scheme of memory management, he chose these verses from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. Wallach spent about 20 hours in the Framingham Public Library, with his nose in Bartlett's familiar quotations, and dipping into some of the actual works, just in order to add these flourishes to his spec. They added something. They revealed the class of feelings that Wallach brought to his job. If he was a Hessian, he was a passionate one, and with the quotations he signed his name to his piece of the new computer. Wallach actually spent far more time looking up epigraphs than it took him to discover the right way to manage and protect the computer's memory. But that small golden moment colored everything else for him. As he saw it, the rest of the plan simply unfolded from that one idea. It was a good omen. How do such moments occur? Hey, Wallach said, no one knows how that works. He remembered that during the time when he was working on the Navy computer for Raytheon, the one that got built and then scrapped. He was at a wedding, and the solution to a different sort of problem popped into his mind. He wrote it down quickly on the cover of a matchbook. I will be constantly chugging away in my mind, he explained, making an exhaustive search of my data bank.